Have you ever had someone steal your property and hand it to their own kid? That's exactly what this unhinged HOA Karen did. She somehow transferred my family's lake cabin to her precious son like it was a gift basket. And the wildest part, I built a fence. Not just any fence, a big wooden line that cut straight through her front yard. Yeah, that happened. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. I'm still trying to wrap my head around how someone could be that bold, that entitled, that shameless. Stick around. Justice shows up in the most satisfying way. This is QA Stories. Let me start by telling you about my grandfather's cabin. This place has been in our family for 30 years, sitting right on the water with its own private dock, surrounded by these massive old oak trees that probably watched my grandfather build the place with his own hands. I inherited it when I was 35, and honestly, it became my sanctuary. I'm a custom woodworker by trade, and there's something about being out there on the lake, working on furniture pieces in that little workshop my grandfather set up, that just centers my whole world. The rustic wood siding, the way the morning light hits the water through those oak branches. I'm not even sure why I'm getting sentimental about it right now, but when you almost lose something that precious, every detail becomes sacred. I still remember this one morning when I was 12, sitting on that dock with my grandfather while he taught me to sand a piece of cedar by hand. "Feel the grain, Clay," he'd say, guiding my small hands across the wood surface. The wood tells you which direction it wants to go. That's when I knew I wanted to be a woodworker, watching him create something beautiful from raw timber with nothing but patience and skill. He'd built that entire cabin the same way, board by board, measuring twice and cutting once, never rushing the process. Looking back, I should have known trouble was coming when Margaret first showed up with that clipboard of hers, but I guess I was too focused on enjoying the peace to see the storm brewing in the form of a middle-aged HOA president with too much time on her hands. That's when Margaret entered my life like a hurricane in a business suit. Margaret was 58, the kind of woman who probably practiced her HOA president's speech in the mirror every morning and had never met a rule she didn't want to enforce twice as hard. She used to be a real estate agent before she decided that controlling our little lakefront community was her true calling, which should have been my first red flag right there. I should have known something was off from her very first courtesy visit, and I use that term loosely because there was nothing courteous about the way she marched up to my dock like she owned the place. "Clay, we need to discuss some compliance issues with your property," she announced, pulling out this official-looking clipboard that I swear she carried just to make herself feel important. The woman had this way of talking about property values and community standards that made my skin crawl. After Margaret left that first day, I actually walked over to my neighbor's house to see if I was overreacting to the whole situation. Tom, who'd lived next to Margaret for 5 years, just shook his head when I described her visit. "She's been sniffing around everyone's property lately," he told me, lowering his voice like Margaret might be listening from her kitchen window. "Last month she tried to tell me my boat lift violated some regulation that didn't even exist. When I pushed back, she backed down real quick." But Tom admitted he'd been too afraid to really challenge her authority, worried she'd make his life miserable with endless HOA violations. Something about his fear made my stomach turn, like we were dealing with more than just an overzealous board member. I thanked Tom for the warning, but part of me was already wondering if I should have taken Margaret more seriously from the beginning. The violations she claimed I had were absolutely ridiculous, and I mean that in the most literal sense possible. According to Margaret, my dock needed HOA approval for waterfront structures, even though it had been there for decades before the HOA even existed. Did she really think a dock that predated her precious association needed retroactive approval? The cabin's rustic wood siding apparently didn't meet their aesthetic standards, which was rich coming from someone whose own house looked like a beige box with shutters slapped on as an afterthought. And get this, my workshop noise violated quiet hours, even though I only worked during normal daytime hours and used hand tools most of the time. I tried explaining this to her, but Margaret had this way of nodding along while clearly not listening to a word I said. "I understand your concerns, Clay, but rules are rules," she'd say with this fake sympathetic smile that made me want to throw something into the lake. But here's what really got under my skin and should have been a massive warning sign. Every single visit, Margaret would make these weird comments about her son Jake. "You know, Jake really appreciates lakefront properties," she'd say, while taking pictures of my dock that she claimed were for HOA records. Or, "Young families need access to recreational areas, don't you think?" I mean, what was I supposed to say to that? The woman was basically telling me her unemployed son deserved my family's cabin more than I did. Looking back, I should have trusted my gut right then and there, but I guess I wanted to believe she was just being an overzealous HOA president instead of, well, whatever the hell she was actually planning. Maybe I should have just walked away from the whole situation right then, packed up my tools and found somewhere else to spend my weekend. I don't know. Questions she asked during these visits were getting weirder and more invasive each time she showed up. She wanted to know about my deed, about the property lines, about when exactly my grandfather had built the dock, even asking about the original survey markers. Just making sure all our records are accurate, she'd explain, but something about the way she said it made my stomach turn. Then she'd get this distant look in her eyes and say something cryptic, like, "Documentation has a way of evolving with time, you know. Sometimes what we think is permanent isn't." I wasn't sure if I was being paranoid or if Margaret was actually hunting for something specific, some weakness in my property ownership that she could exploit. The way she said it, like she knew something I didn't, made my blood run cold. I should have pressed her on what she meant, but honestly, I was afraid of the answer. The final straw came when she handed me this official-looking letter, claiming my dock permit was under review and that I needed to cease all waterfront activities immediately. I actually had to read that thing 3 times before it sank in. This woman was trying to kick me off my own dock on my own property that my own grandfather had built with his own hands. Standing there holding that letter, watching Margaret walk back to her beige house with that satisfied little smirk on her face, I realized this wasn't just about HOA compliance anymore. Margaret wasn't just being a pain in my ass for the sake of bureaucratic power, she was hunting for something specific. But what could she possibly want with my family's cabin? I mean, the woman already had her own house in the same neighborhood, and it wasn't like her community was hurting for waterfront access. What more could she need? I wish I could tell you I figured it out right then, but honestly, I was still giving her the benefit of the doubt. That's when Jake entered the picture. And let me tell you, this kid was everything you'd expect from someone raised by Margaret, but somehow even worse. 28 years old, never held a real job in his life, and had this entitled attitude that made his mother look humble by comparison. Jake had this way of talking about his future lake house and how he deserved waterfront access since he'd grown up in the neighborhood, like proximity to water was some kind of birthright. Did he really say that out loud, about deserving my property? I mean, I knew entitled people existed, but hearing it in person was something else entirely. The first time he showed up at my cabin, I was working on a custom dining table in my workshop when I heard footsteps on my dock. What really got to me was watching Jake run his hands along my dock railing like he was already claiming it as his own. He wasn't just looking at my property, he was touching it, feeling the wood grain, testing how solid the posts were. I could see him mentally replacing everything, probably imagining where he'd put a new boat lift or maybe expand the deck. The way he moved around my space felt territorial, like a dog marking its territory, and it made me deeply uncomfortable in a way I couldn't quite put into words. He'd stop at different angles and take pictures, but not casual vacation photos. These were deliberate, measured shots, like he was documenting something important. "Hey there, I'm Jake, Margaret's son," he introduced himself with this fake, friendly smile that reminded me way too much of his mother's practiced expressions. "Just walking the neighborhood, admiring the craftsmanship." That should have been my second red flag right there, but I was trying to be neighborly and give the kid the benefit of the doubt. We chatted for a few minutes about woodworking and lake life, and the whole time Jake kept looking around my property with these calculating eyes, like he was mentally redecorating the place or pricing out the improvements he'd make. When I caught him actually measuring my dock with his phone, I had to say something. "Dude, why are you measuring my dock? This is private property." His response still makes my blood boil when I think about it. "Just admiring the craftsmanship, man. This'll make a great family retreat someday." But Jake's visits kept getting bolder and more frequent, and I'm talking about showing up multiple times a week like he was casing the joint. One time I was watching from my kitchen window and saw him pull out a small notebook and start sketching different angles of my dock, writing notes in the margins like he was planning renovations. The notebook had renovation ideas written on the cover in his messy handwriting, which made my stomach drop. This kid was literally planning to renovate my property while I was still living in it. Another time, I caught him with an actual measuring tape, pacing off the distance from my cabin to the water like he was planning some kind of construction project. "What exactly are you doing?" I asked him, and Jake just laughed it off like I was being paranoid. Mom's got me helping with the HOA boundary survey stuff, just making sure everything's up to code, he said, but something about his tone didn't ring true. That can't be right, can it? Since when do HOA presidents send their unemployed sons to do official surveying work? I should have called Margaret right then to ask what the hell was going on, but something told me she'd just give me another one of her fake apologetic speeches. The whole situation was making me question my own judgment. Was I being paranoid? Or were these people actually planning something sinister? Maybe I was reading too much into innocent behavior, but every instinct I had was screaming that something wasn't right about the way Jake was studying my property. Meanwhile, Margaret was escalating her legal tactics in ways that made my head spin and my lawyer bills pile up. The letters kept coming, each one more threatening than the last, each one claiming some new violation or concern that needed immediate attention. Apparently, my property taxes might be incorrectly assessed, and there were questions about historical property boundaries that needed to be resolved by professionals. The HOA needed to verify all waterfront deed restrictions for reasons she never quite explained in any coherent way. I'm not a legal expert, but none of this seemed normal to me, especially considering I'd never had any problems with property taxes or boundaries in all the years I'd owned the place. When I asked my neighbors if they'd gotten similar letters, they all shook their heads and gave me these sympathetic looks. The father-son tag team was becoming impossible to ignore, and I'm talking about coordinated surveillance that would have made private investigators proud. I'd see them having these hushed conversations in Margaret's front yard, pointing at my cabin and looking at documents spread across her porch table like they were planning some kind of military operation. They thought they were being sneaky, but my workshop window had a perfect view of their little planning sessions, and let me tell you, watching them gesture at my property while looking at what appeared to be official paperwork made my stomach churn. Part of me started wondering if I should just walk away from the whole mess, sell the cabin and find peace somewhere else. But every time I considered giving up, I'd remember my grandfather's hands, guiding mine across that piece of cedar, teaching me that some things are worth fighting for. The cost of fighting this battle was already weighing on me, both financially and emotionally. Legal consultations weren't cheap, and every threatening letter from Margaret meant another phone call to my lawyer, another billable hour trying to understand what she was actually claiming. I found myself lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling and wondering if I was being stubborn or brave. Maybe Margaret would eventually get bored and move on to terrorizing someone else. Maybe I should have just paid whatever fees she wanted and kept the peace. But then I'd think about my grandfather building that dock with his own hands, about all the summer mornings we'd spent there together, and I knew I couldn't just hand over my family's legacy to appease a bully. The emotional toll was getting harder to ignore, though. The final straw came when Margaret knocked on my cabin door with another official-looking document and her most serious HOA president expression. "Clay, the HOA board has decided to conduct a comprehensive property boundary survey of all lakefront homes," she announced, like she was doing me some kind of favor instead of delivering what felt like a threat. "We need to make sure everyone's in compliance with the original development plans." I asked her why this was suddenly necessary after 30 years of peaceful coexistence, and she gave me this vague answer about protecting property values and preventing future disputes. Something about that boundary survey felt like a trap being set, like the final piece of some elaborate puzzle I couldn't see yet. Were they really just checking property lines, or were they planning something way worse? The boundary survey results were delivered to me on a Tuesday morning that started out perfectly normal and ended with my entire world turned upside down like a snow globe in the hands of a vindictive child. Margaret showed up at my cabin with this thick folder of official-looking documents, wearing her most serious HOA president expression, and flanked by what appeared to be a professional surveyor. "Clay, I'm afraid we've discovered a significant historical boundary error," she announced, spreading papers across my kitchen table like she was conducting some kind of board meeting or legal proceeding. According to these documents, there had been a mistake in the original survey from 30 years ago, and a portion of my property, including my cabin, actually belonged to the HOA common area. I actually had to read that twice before it sank in because the implications were so absurd. The disorientation hit me like a physical blow, and I had to sit down on the dock to process what Margaret was claiming. I found myself running my hands over the weathered wood planks, feeling the hammer marks my grandfather had left when he built this place, board by board. These weren't just random indentations. They were evidence of his craftsmanship, proof that he'd built something meant to last generations. I could remember being 8 years old, holding nails steady while he hammered them into place, telling me stories about the importance of building things right the first time. How could something so solid, so real, so tied to my family's history suddenly not belong to us? The whole conversation felt surreal, like Margaret was speaking a different language, where words like ownership and property had completely different meanings. I'm not gonna lie, my first reaction was to laugh, because the whole thing seemed so ridiculous and far-fetched that it had to be some kind of elaborate prank. But Margaret wasn't laughing, and neither was the surveyor standing behind her with his official clipboard. She had survey maps, historical documents, and what appeared to be official county records showing that my property line was 50 feet further back than where it had been for 3 decades. This explains why your dock permit has been problematic, she explained in this patronizing tone that made me want to scream at the top of my lungs. Technically, you've been maintaining structures on HOA property without authorization. I wasn't sure if I was more angry or confused at that point. Because how does a property line just move 50 feet overnight? How does land that's been in my family for 30 years suddenly belong to the homeowners association? That's when I decided to take these documents to a real estate lawyer, and thank God I did, because what we discovered was absolutely mind-blowing in its audacity and criminal sophistication. My lawyer, a sharp woman who'd been handling property disputes for 20 years, took one look at Margaret's paperwork and immediately spotted something fishy about the documentation. These boundary corrections appeared to have been filed very recently, she told me, pointing to dates on the documents that made my blood run cold. Someone has been using old real estate connections to create revised surveys and update historical property records. But then she leaned back in her chair and said something that made my stomach drop even further. This isn't the first time I've seen tactics like this. There was a similar case up at Lake Morrison a few years back, the same type of fraudulent documentation. The lawyer dug deeper and uncovered Margaret's entire scheme, and I swear I felt physically ill when she explained the full extent of what Margaret had orchestrated. Margaret hadn't just moved my property line, she'd created a whole paper trail, making it look like the error had existed for decades and was only now being corrected through proper legal channels. This is sophisticated fraud, the lawyer told me, and hearing that word fraud made everything click into place like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. This wasn't about HOA compliance or property values or community standards. This woman was literally trying to steal my grandfather's cabin using fake documents and her old real estate connections. I mean, who does that? Who wakes up one morning and decides to commit property fraud just to get their unemployed son a lakefront home? The sheer audacity and premeditation of it all was staggering. But here's the part that really made me lose my mind and consider doing something I might regret. The lawyer discovered Margaret's endgame through some additional research she did at the county office. The plan was for the HOA to reclaim my cabin as common property, then immediately lease it long-term to Jake for basically nothing. Margaret had already drafted a lease agreement that would give Jake exclusive use of the lakefront common area structure for $99 a month. $99 for a cabin that was easily worth $3,000 a month in rental income. She was literally planning to steal my family's property and hand it to her spoiled kid on a silver platter, all while making it look like legitimate HOA business. When the lawyer showed me that lease agreement, I couldn't even speak for a full minute. I just dropped the paper and walked outside her office, needing air, needing space to process the magnitude of what Margaret was trying to do. Standing in the parking lot behind the lawyer's office, I felt this crushing weight of injustice that threatened to break me completely. This woman had spent months harassing me about fake violations, sending her son to spy on my property, and creating fraudulent documents to justify stealing my cabin. And for what? So Jake could have the lakefront lifestyle he'd never worked for and didn't deserve? The emotional weight of potentially losing my grandfather's legacy to some elaborate con game was crushing. Like watching everything meaningful in your life get stolen by people who saw it as nothing more than a free upgrade. I thought about my grandfather's hands teaching mine to feel the grain of the wood, about summer mornings spent learning craftsmanship from a man who understood that some things can't be bought or stolen, they have to be earned. The problem was, she warned me that legal battles like this could take years and cost tens of thousands of dollars, with no guarantee of a favorable outcome. These fraud cases can get messy, she explained. Even when we know someone's lying, proving it in court is a different matter entirely. Margaret's got connections, resources, and she's been playing this for months. We're playing catch-up. The lawyer's honesty was both refreshing and terrifying. At least I knew what I was up against. But the odds weren't exactly in my favor. That's when Margaret served me with an official eviction notice, claiming I was illegally occupying HOA common property and had 30 days to remove all my belongings from the cabin. Holding that eviction notice in my hands, I felt this crushing weight of injustice that I'd never experienced before. I had a choice to make: fight this in court for years and maybe lose everything, or find another way to protect what was rightfully mine. That night, I sat in my workshop surrounded by my grandfather's tools, running my fingers along the handle of his favorite chisel, while staring at the eviction notice spread out on his old workbench. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, holding the tool he'd used to carve beauty from raw wood, while some stranger tried to carve my family's legacy right out from under me. I picked up that chisel and tested its edge against my thumb, feeling the razor sharpness he'd maintained until the day he died. Looking at the eviction notice, then at the tool in my hands, I felt something shift inside me. Margaret wanted to play games with property lines and legal documents? Fine, but she was about to learn that some people fight back with more than just lawyers and paperwork. Despite my lawyer's protests and all the evidence we'd gathered about Margaret's fraud, she somehow managed to push through the boundary correction with the county office in record time. I'm still not entirely sure how she pulled it off, but having old connections in the real estate world apparently opens doors that should have stayed locked. The cabin officially got transferred to HOA ownership on a Friday afternoon, and by Monday morning I was locked out of my own family property like some kind of trespasser. Margaret had changed the locks over the weekend and posted "no trespassing" signs all over what used to be my grandfather's land. I felt this rage building inside me that I'd never experienced before in my entire life. I didn't even try the key again, just stood there staring at the lock, half hoping this was all a mistake, knowing it wasn't. "This can't be real," I muttered to myself, staring at the brass lock that looked brand new compared to the weathered door my grandfather had hung decades ago. I walked around the cabin, checking every window, and discovered that Margaret had even bolted those shut from the inside. The "no trespassing" sign nailed to my grandfather's oak tree might as well have been written in a foreign language for how much sense it made to see it on property that had been in my family for 30 years. I kept reading it over and over, like the words would suddenly rearrange themselves into something that made sense. But the ultimate insult was what happened next, and I'm talking about a level of audacity that still makes my blood boil. Jake immediately moved into my cabin like he'd been planning this moment his whole life. And I mean, same day, same hour that I got locked out. He'd already had a moving truck ready to go, which tells you everything you need to know about how long they'd been plotting this theft. But here's what really twisted the knife. Jake hadn't brought a thing. He simply claimed my life as his own, right down to my bed, my coffee mugs, and the old rocking chair by the window. The kid had moved into my life, not just my property, and was living it like it had always belonged to him. The worst part was seeing my workshop tools scattered around like Jake had been going through everything, trying to figure out how to use equipment he'd clearly never seen before. But what nearly broke me was catching sight of him through the kitchen window, drinking coffee from a handmade mug I'd crafted with my grandfather one summer when I was 14. The mug still had my grandfather's initials, J.M.M., carved into the handle, where I'd practiced using his wood-burning kit. Watching some entitled stranger use something so personal, so tied to my memories of learning craftsmanship from the man who'd raised me, hit me like a gut punch, like watching someone laugh at a eulogy. Jake was literally drinking from my childhood memories, while living in my family's legacy. Jake posted pictures online of himself living it up in his new lake house, using captions about finally getting the waterfront lifestyle I deserve, and grateful for family who looks out for family. I tried scrolling through the photos to see what else he was doing to my property, but my hands started shaking so bad I had to put the phone down before I dropped it. The shame was almost worse than the anger. Shame that I'd let this happen, shame that some spoiled kid was broadcasting my humiliation to his friends. I couldn't even finish looking at the posts because the combination of rage and helplessness was making me physically sick. Seeing him pose with my grandfather's tools, grinning in front of the dock we'd built together, was like watching a stranger wear my father's wedding ring. You know, I've shared property dispute stories before, but living through this theft was a whole different level of betrayal and systematic destruction. This wasn't just someone being rude or unreasonable. This was calculated, premeditated destruction of everything my family had built at this lake over 3 decades. Margaret wasn't just taking my cabin, she was erasing my grandfather's legacy and handing it to someone who saw it as nothing more than a free upgrade to his lifestyle. What would you do if someone literally stole your family home and gave it to their kid like it was some kind of graduation present? Because I'll be honest, I spent a lot of sleepless nights trying to figure out how to respond without ending up in jail myself. Margaret, meanwhile, was having her victory lap around the neighborhood like she'd just solved world hunger instead of committing felony fraud. She was telling anyone who'd listen about how she'd solved the boundary issue and how Jake was such a responsible young man who'll take great care of the lakefront property. I heard through neighbors that she was spinning the whole thing like she'd done the community a favor by correcting historical property errors and ensuring proper management of common areas. The woman had turned property theft into a public service announcement, and people were actually buying it because they didn't know the full story. I wasn't sure whether to be impressed by her audacity or disgusted by her complete lack of shame. The breaking point came when Jake threw a housewarming party at my cabin, and I'm talking loud music, boats tied up to my dock, people I'd never seen before acting like they owned the place. I could hear the party from my house a quarter-mile away, and the sound of strangers laughing and partying in my grandfather's cabin was like nails on a chalkboard. I actually drove over there around midnight, not really sure what I was planning to do, and found Jake and his friends using my workshop as a bar area. They'd moved all my tools to one corner and set up a drink station where my grandfather's workbench used to be. Standing there watching strangers party in my grandfather's cabin, I realized something that changed everything about how I was going to handle this situation. That night, staring at the cabin that should have been mine, listening to party music echoing across the water, I started forming a plan that was either going to be brilliant revenge or the stupidest thing I'd ever done. I walked back to my truck and pulled out a wooden surveyor's stake from my toolbox, the kind my grandfather had taught me to use when we'd help neighbors mark their property lines decades ago. I drove it into the soft earth at the edge of Margaret's yard with my boot, pushing it down until it stood firm and straight. "You want lines?" I whispered to myself, thinking about all the real boundaries that were about to become very, very clear. "I'll show you where they are." The universe doesn't usually hand you the tools for perfect revenge, but sometimes the answer is right there in your grandfather's toolbox. The next morning, I hired my own surveyor, a guy who'd been doing boundary work in our county for 15 years and had zero connection to Margaret or her real estate cronies. What he discovered when he did a legitimate survey of the neighborhood was absolutely beautiful in its irony and poetic justice. Margaret's own house, the beige fortress she'd been operating from while stealing everyone else's property, was sitting 15 feet over onto what should legally be HOA common area according to the original development plans. I'm not even kidding. Her front yard, her prized garden, even her mailbox were technically on community property that belonged to all of us homeowners. When the surveyor showed me the measurements, I actually started laughing, not out of joy, but out of pure disbelief at how perfectly the universe had arranged this situation. The universe doesn't usually hand you poetic justice on a silver platter, but damn if this wasn't one of those times. Here I was, devastated about losing my family's cabin to fraudulent boundary manipulation, and it turns out the person who stole it had been squatting on HOA property for years without realizing it. The irony was so perfect it felt scripted, like some cosmic joke, where the villain accidentally sets up their own downfall while trying to destroy the hero. I kept staring at the survey documents, reading the measurements over and over, because it seemed too good to be true. But there it was, in black and white. Margaret's house was 15 feet over the line onto land that legally belonged to all of us. Using Margaret's own twisted logic against her felt like poetic justice in its purest form, and I'm talking about turning her weapons against her in the most satisfying way possible. I filed paperwork with the county showing that Margaret's front yard legally belonged to the HOA common area, which meant that, as a homeowner in the community, I had rights to use that space just like any other shared amenity. The county clerk raised an eyebrow when I spread the survey documents across her desk. "Wait, you're saying her property's out of line now?" she asked, looking from the paperwork to me with obvious confusion. I looked her straight in the eye and said, "Not saying, showing." The clerk studied the documents for a long moment and slowly nodded as the reality of Margaret's situation became clear. That's when I started building my fence, and let me tell you, it was the most satisfying construction project of my entire career as a woodworker. I'm talking about a beautiful custom wooden fence that ran along the actual property boundaries, which meant it cut straight through Margaret's front lawn like a knife through butter. The fence line went right up to her front steps, effectively blocking her main walkway and turning her prized garden into a divided mess. I used the best materials I could find, cedar posts and custom-milled boards that would last for decades, because I wanted this fence to be a permanent reminder of what happens when you mess with property boundaries. When I reached the third post from the edge, I paused mid-hammer swing and carved JT. "We keep, ours ours." into the wood with my grandfather's old chisel. Margaret's panic when she saw me laying out the fence line was absolutely priceless, and I wish I could have recorded her reaction for posterity. She came running out of her house in her bathrobe, screaming about how I couldn't build a fence through her yard like some kind of property-destroying maniac. "You can't do this, Clay, this is my property," she kept yelling, while I calmly continued measuring and marking post locations with the precision of someone who'd been doing woodwork for decades. But here's what made the moment even sweeter. I noticed curtains shifting in windows across the street, neighbors watching from their porches. But for the first time since this whole mess started, nobody was coming to Margaret's rescue. The woman who'd built her power on intimidating individual homeowners was now facing very public humiliation. I looked up at her with the most innocent expression I could manage and said, "According to your own boundary survey methodology, this isn't your yard anymore, Margaret. It's HOA common property, and I'm just exercising my rights as a community member." I wish you could have seen her face when those words sank in, when she realized her own tactics were being used against her with mathematical precision. The woman who'd built a career on manipulating property lines had just been outmaneuvered by her own fraud, and there wasn't a damn thing she could do about it without admitting that her own boundary games had been illegitimate from the start. She stood there sputtering about property rights and HOA regulations while I continued building my fence, using her own arguments to justify every post I planted. Jake's reaction was almost as good as his mother's, and watching his confidence crumble was deeply satisfying. The kid had gone from cocky cabin owner to nervous wreck in the span of a few days as the reality of his situation became clear. Neighbors were starting to ask questions about the property dispute, and Jake was realizing that living in a stolen cabin might not be the victimless crime his mother had convinced him it was. He actually had the nerve to approach me while I was building the fence, trying to negotiate some kind of compromise, like we were discussing a parking dispute instead of grand theft. "Look, man, maybe we can work something out," he said, like there was some middle ground between him living in my stolen cabin and me getting my property back. I just kept working on my fence posts and told him that if he wanted to resolve anything, he could start by moving out. By the time I finished the fence, it had become the talk of the entire neighborhood and beyond, with people driving by to see the property line that cut straight through Margaret's front yard. I'd effectively trapped her in her own house since the fence blocked her main walkway access, forcing her to use a side entrance like some kind of secondary resident on her own property. I'd installed a beautiful hand-carved sign that read, "Boundaries matter. Survey completed," with the date prominently displayed, making it clear that this wasn't some random act of spite, but a legitimate response to boundary manipulation. Ever seen someone's face when they realized their master plan just backfired spectacularly? Because Margaret looked like she'd aged 10 years in the 2 weeks it took me to build that fence. The fence stood as proof that when someone tries to steal your property using legal tricks, sometimes the best response is to use their own lies against them. The fence had an unexpected side effect that I hadn't anticipated, and I'm talking about a domino effect that spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. It got other homeowners asking questions about their own property boundaries, wondering if they'd been victims of Margaret's manipulation too. When people drove by to see the fence cutting through Margaret's yard, they started wondering if their property lines were accurate, and if Margaret had been playing games with more than just my land. It wasn't just a fence. It was the first time someone had drawn a line and dared others to question who crossed it. The elderly couple who lived 3 houses down from Margaret were the first ones to approach me about doing their own boundary survey. "Clay, we've always wondered about that gazebo situation from a few years back," they told me, referring to a time when Margaret had forced them to remove a beautiful gazebo they'd built in their backyard. That's when the neighborhood investigation really took off, and what we discovered was absolutely incredible in its scope and audacity. Margaret hadn't just been targeting me. She'd been manipulating property records throughout the community for years, always in ways that benefited her personally, or gave her more control over other people's property. The elderly couple's gazebo had been sitting on their own land the entire time, and Margaret had bullied them into removing it, for no legitimate reason other than her own power trip. Another neighbor discovered that Margaret had been reporting inflated square footage for her own house to increase its assessed value, while simultaneously challenging other people's property assessments to keep their values artificially low. The woman had been running a years-long scheme to manipulate property values and boundaries throughout our entire neighborhood, and nobody had caught on because people trusted their HOA president. The HOA rebellion that followed was like nothing I'd ever seen in a residential community. And I'm talking about a grassroots uprising that would have made political organizers proud. Homeowners who'd been intimidated by Margaret for years suddenly found their voices when they realized she'd been systematically scamming all of us while hiding behind her official position. A group of neighbors demanded Margaret's immediate removal from the HOA board. And when she tried to resist by claiming executive privilege, they threatened to involve the county authorities in investigating all her property manipulation schemes. People were furious when they realized how long Margaret had been using her position to benefit herself while making everyone else's lives miserable through fake violations and fraudulent boundary disputes. I wasn't sure whether to be proud or terrified of what I'd unleashed, but watching the community finally stand up to Margaret felt like justice in its purest form. Margaret's desperation as she lost control of the neighborhood was almost sad to watch. Almost, but not quite. She tried rallying support by claiming I was destroying neighborhood property values with my fence and setting a dangerous precedent for property disputes. But nobody was buying her victim act anymore, not when they'd discovered the extent of her own property manipulation schemes. Her years of bullying and manipulation had finally caught up with her, and the neighbors she'd terrorized were eager to share their own stories about Margaret's abuse of power. During what turned out to be her final board meeting, even Terry, her closest ally, slipped out the side door without a word. The woman who'd built her reputation on protecting community standards was exposed as someone who'd been systematically violating those same standards for her own benefit. Did she really think she could manipulate an entire neighborhood forever without anyone catching on? Meanwhile, my fence was becoming a local landmark and symbol of resistance that people talked about for miles around. I'd finished it with a beautiful stain that highlighted the natural wood grain, and the hand-carved sign had become a symbol of resistance against HOA tyranny and property manipulation. People would bring their kids by to teach them about property rights and standing up to bullies, which, honestly, wasn't something I'd expected when I started this whole revenge plan. The fence effectively trapped Margaret and Jake in their respective properties since it blocked the main walkway access to Margaret's house. And watching them try to navigate around it every day was a constant reminder of how their scheme had backfired. Margaret was learning that when you mess with property boundaries, sometimes those boundaries fight back in ways you never expected, and the consequences can last a lot longer than you planned. The community support was overwhelming and completely unexpected, like nothing I'd experienced in all my years of living here. Neighbors who'd barely spoken to me before were stopping by to share their own Margaret horror stories and to thank me for finally standing up to her systematic abuse. The woman had been a neighborhood terror for so long that people had just accepted her behavior as an unavoidable part of living in the community, like dealing with bad weather or property taxes. But seeing her trapped behind my fence, no longer able to intimidate anyone, gave people hope that bullies could actually face consequences for their actions. I realized that my fight wasn't just about getting my cabin back anymore. It had become about proving that people like Margaret couldn't manipulate and steal from their neighbors without eventually facing justice. The fence was just the beginning of Margaret's downfall, and the community was eager to help finish what I'd started, to make sure she never had the power to hurt anyone again. The county investigation that followed was more thorough than anything I could have hoped for, and the results were absolutely devastating for Margaret in ways that exceeded my wildest dreams of revenge. When the authorities started digging into her property manipulation schemes, they discovered she'd been running this con for nearly a decade, using her old real estate license and connections to falsify documents and manipulate boundary lines throughout multiple neighborhoods. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars in stolen property value, fraudulent tax assessments, and abuse of her HOA authority on a scale that boggled my mind and the investigators. I mean, how long had this woman been getting away with systematic property fraud while hiding behind her position as a community leader? The investigators found evidence of at least 15 separate boundary manipulations, all designed to benefit Margaret personally or to punish neighbors who'd crossed her in some way. The criminal charges that came down were everything I'd dreamed of and more, like Christmas morning for someone who'd been systematically robbed. Margaret was hit with multiple counts of fraud for falsifying property documents, theft charges for the cabin transfer, abuse of authority as HOA president, and even tax evasion for systematically underreporting her own property value while inflating her assessments. Jake got charged as an accomplice for knowingly living in stolen property, and those social media posts he'd made bragging about his lake house became evidence against him in court. Did he really think posting pictures of himself living in stolen property was a good idea? The kid's own arrogance and need for social media validation became the prosecutor's best friend when it came to proving he knew exactly what his mother had done and was a willing participant in the fraud. My complete victory was more satisfying than anything I could have imagined when this whole nightmare started with Margaret's first courtesy visit. I got my cabin back with all the original furnishings and tools exactly as they'd been. Plus, the county paid for all my legal fees and fence construction costs as part of the settlement. Margaret was ordered to pay me $35,000 in damages and lost rental income, which honestly felt like winning the lottery after everything I'd been through. But the best part was that my fence got to stay up as a permanent reminder of what happens when you mess with property boundaries and try to steal from your neighbors. What I got back wasn't just a building. It was my family's story, still standing. The county actually commended me for using legitimate surveying methods to expose fraudulent boundary manipulation, which was their fancy way of saying I'd beaten Margaret at her own game using truth and actual property law. Margaret's total downfall was swift and complete, in a way that felt like something out of a movie, where the villain finally gets their comeuppance. She was sentenced to 14 months in county jail, forced to sell her house to pay restitution to all the neighbors she'd scammed over the years, and banned from ever serving on an HOA board again for the rest of her life. The woman who'd spent years terrorizing our neighborhood was now facing bankruptcy and prison time, all because she got greedy and tried to steal one too many properties from people who trusted her. The beautiful irony was that she had to use my fence gate to access what was left of her property during the few weeks before she lost it completely. To get her mail, she now had to walk past the hand-carved sign that marked the truth she tried to erase. Watching Margaret walk through my fence to get to her own front door was probably the most satisfying moment of this entire saga, a daily reminder that her own tactics had been used against her. Jake's humiliation was almost as sweet as his mother's downfall, and watching his entitled lifestyle crumble was deeply satisfying. The entitled trust fund kid had to move back in with relatives, delete all his social media posts about his lake house, and get a minimum wage job to help pay his mother's restitution. The kid who'd never worked a real day in his life was suddenly stocking shelves at a grocery store, trying to earn money to pay back the people his family had stolen from. I actually saw him there one day when I was buying supplies for a furniture project, and the look on his face when he recognized me was priceless. Pure shame mixed with the reality that actions have consequences. No more bragging about lakefront lifestyles he didn't earn, just the harsh reality of working for a living like everyone else. Sometimes the best revenge is just letting people destroy themselves with their own greed, don't you think? The community transformation that followed Margaret's downfall was incredible to witness and gave me hope for neighborhood democracy. A new HOA board got elected with a mandate to reverse all of Margaret's fraudulent boundary changes and to operate with complete transparency and accountability. They installed a community bulletin board right next to my fence with real property survey maps for everyone to see, ensuring that no future HOA president could manipulate boundaries without the entire neighborhood knowing about it immediately. The elderly couple got to rebuild their gazebo in the exact spot where Margaret had forced them to remove it, and other neighbors started projects they'd been afraid to attempt under Margaret's reign of terror. My fence had become a symbol of resistance that inspired the entire community to reclaim their property rights and never again allow one person to wield that kind of fraudulent power. 6 months later, I'm back in my grandfather's cabin every weekend, working on custom furniture orders and enjoying the peace that comes from knowing justice was finally served in the most complete way possible. My fence has become a genuine neighborhood landmark. People bring their kids by to teach them about property rights and standing up to bullies, which, honestly, makes me proud in ways I never expected. Every morning, I drink coffee on my dock, looking at that fence, cutting through what used to be Margaret's yard and is now a small community park maintained by the new HOA board. The cabin feels even more special knowing I fought for it and won, proving that family legacies can survive even the most elaborate theft schemes when you're willing to fight back with truth and determination. Margaret thought she could steal my grandfather's legacy and hand it to her spoiled son using lies and fraud. But instead, she lost everything and gave me the perfect opportunity to show the whole neighborhood what real property boundaries look like. When someone tries to steal your property with legal tricks and fake documents, sometimes the best fence is the one that stands as proof that some boundaries, emotional or otherwise, are not meant to be redrawn with fraud. And in the hush of the lake, that fence stayed right where I built it, quiet as justice, firm as grief, permanent as legacy. What would you have done if it were you? If this story hit home or just made you pause, Go ahead and like, leave a comment, or subscribe to QE Stories for more. And if you feel like showing some love, there's a thanks button right below. Either way, I appreciate you for listening. See y'all next time.
QA Stories thanks you for hanging out today. Don't forget to binge a few more. Trust us, you'll be hooked.